Students, this lecture is at the bottom of the chapter 6 page, and sometimes it helps my students to hear the information as well as to read it. So I'm going to do exactly that. And what I shall do is put my icon or my small thumbnail sketch at the top so you can read this. So Samuel is the first person that we're going to encounter. We heard about his mother's song of joy upon learning that she would be the mother of a child, and she gives him to Eli to raise. So he's adopted into the house of Levi and becomes a Nazirite, a priest of the house of Levi. He is the first prophet after Moses, because Moses is in a category all by himself as the great lawgiver. The Mosaic Law, the first 5 books of the Bible called the Torah or the Pentateuch, are attributed to Moses, and he is the greatest figure in the Hebrew Scriptures. But Samuel is an important figure too. So he is the first prophet and the last of the judges. He's a transitional figure into a new era, that of the monarchy. He hears the voice of God from the time he is a boy, and we're going to read that story together. Samuel replaces the priest of Bethel, Eli, whose sons are evil. Samuel is extremely angry when the Israelites later ask him for a king to unify them. And that is because Samuel is becoming old. His own sons are evil like those of Eli. So the people will not accept the sons of Samuel either. And God tells Samuel to listen to the people and to anoint Saul as king. Saul begins well. He is humble and a brave soldier, a brave warrior. However, he is erratic. He is subject to fits of anger and depression. Saul also makes decisions that conflict with Samuel's directions from God. He performs sacrifices that should be performed only by a priest. Saul also does not carry out the ban against the Amalekites and their king Agag. Samuel confronts Saul, tells him that God has rejected him, and kills Agag. In the book of Esther, we meet a descendant of Agag, Haman. Haman is an evil man who tries to use his influence with the king of Persia to exterminate the Jewish people. Queen Esther of the tribe of Benjamin, and a descendant of Saul's family, pleads for her people and saves them. The Feast of Purim remembers these events. In secret, Samuel anoints David as the next king, and we're also going to look at that story. David is still a shepherd boy. David comes into Saul's service as a musician and armor bearer. He wins fame by slaying Goliath, a duty which should have been the king's. David becomes a very popular warrior and is loved by Jonathan, Saul's oldest son, and Michal, Saul's younger daughter. David marries Michal, but then has to flee for his life from Saul. Both Jonathan and Michal help David. After David escapes, Saul gives Michal in marriage to another man, Paltiel. Saul pursues David, but David eludes him. At the same time, David remains faithful to Saul and does not kill or harm him, even when the opportunity to do so occurs twice. David laments their death in a song. It's at the beginning of the second book of Samuel, chapter 1, verses 19 through 27. David comes to power as the next king of Judah. The house of David and the house of Saul fight. At the same time, Michal is returned to David. This is a political choice by David, not by her. Her husband, Paltiel, follows after her grieving, but is powerless to save her. Michal comes to hate David. Joab, David's general, murders Abner and Ishbaal. Saul's general, and Saul's son. This is done without David's knowledge, and David mourns because he has made a vow to Saul that he would protect his descendants. However, the death of these two men effectively makes David the king of all 12 tribes of Israel. David captures Jerusalem, a Jebusite city. He probably does this by entering through the city's underground water shaft. Jerusalem becomes his capital city. Note, this seems to have happened with little bloodshed. The Jebusite king and people surrender to David and accept his rule, becoming part of Israel. They were a cultured people with much to offer, and they continued to live in Jerusalem. Some scholars, for example Dr. Karen Armstrong, believe that the prophet Nathan, the priest Zadok, and Bathsheba may have been Jebusites, and there may have been tension between the traditional Israelite leadership and the newly included Jebusite leadership. Some of David's champions, including Uriah the Hittite, Bathsheba's husband, were allies from other Canaanite nations. David moves the Ark of the Covenant from Bethel, which is within a tabernacle, to Jerusalem. When David dances before the ark, Michal expresses her scorn of David because he is dancing in his loincloth, which actually was pretty modest. He probably was wearing what the priests wear, okay? And so it was not immodest, but she sees it as something terrible. David and Michal have nothing to do with each other after that. Michal remains in his house because she is a royal woman and daughter of Saul. But she has no child, a tragedy to a woman of that time. David wishes to build a temple to house the Ark of the Covenant. However, the prophet Nathan tells him that it's not David who will build the temple, but his son. Instead, God assures David that his house, his royal line of descendants, will endure forever. This is known as the Davidic covenant. Jews of later times saw this promise as God's announcement of a future Messiah, an anointed one of David's lineage, who would come to deliver the people from oppression. Christians interpret the Davidic covenant as fulfilled in Jesus. Now, as we read these accounts, written by the Deuteronomists, we have a lens through which to view them. The 13 attributes of God, which is a God of justice and a God of mercy. As Christians, we also have the lens of the mercy of Jesus, his compassion for all people. But at the same time, we have to remember he too is the just judge, and that and he portrays the final judgment of all people at the end of time as being a time of justice. So we have to know that justice and mercy are shown in these stories, and how is something we're going to discuss and ponder together, okay? But the 13 attributes of God that we look at in Exodus 34 and Leviticus 18, 1-30, these all teach the sanctity of sex and marriage and condemn adultery, rape, and incest. Abuse of the stranger, murder, oppression of the defenseless poor, widow and orphan are condemned in the 12 curses in Deuteronomy chapter 27. Adultery, rape, and murder are capital offenses. So we're going to look at what the kings do in these books, and we're going to look at what their children do or their children suffer, okay? There are consequences. So this is where the 13 attributes are extremely important. Besides Michal, David now has 6 wives and 6 sons. After years of leading his troops in battle, 1 year David remains in Jerusalem. Strolling on his rooftop one evening, probably the highest vantage point in Jerusalem, David spies Bathsheba bathing. A note: people could not bathe indoors. There was no indoor plumbing. Usually you would go to the rooftop of your home, put tall screens around so that nobody could see you, and bathe. You might have a courtyard, which again had walls, and you would be protected from view. But if your king is not in battle with your husband, Uriah was out fighting the war with all the other men, and the king has stayed home, and you didn't count on his being home or having a rooftop that he could spy on, well, that's what happened. So she may have been blameless, and Nathan never accuses Bathsheba of doing wrong. Nevertheless, what happens is this: David misuses his power as king to bring Bathsheba to the palace, and he commits adultery. So we don't know for sure how much of this was voluntary on Bathsheba's part. We really don't know. When Bathsheba became pregnant, David had her husband Uriah the Hittite killed. Then he marries Bathsheba. Uriah was a brave and principled man, one of David's mighty men according to the first book of Chronicles. I think there were about 30 mighty men, not many. So that was quite an honor to be counted that among that group. Nathan the prophet confronts David by telling a parable. David condemns the evil committed by the man in the parable, only to discover that he is that man. David repents, and we're going to pray Psalm 51 on Friday, which is traditionally the day that we remember the Passion of Jesus Christ. But we also remember our sins, and because David committed so many that are really acknowledged in this incredible psalm, we're going to pray that on Friday. The consequences of David's acts are seen in the death of his first son by Bathsheba. The child dies shortly after birth. David and Bathsheba have 4 more sons. The oldest is Solomon. David's sins and crimes give a horrible example to his own children. David's firstborn son, Amnon, rapes his half-sister Tamar. When David does nothing, Tamar's full brother Absalom has Amnon killed. David loves Absalom and again does nothing. Absalom leads a rebellion against David, who flees Jerusalem. Joab, David's general, kills Absalom, and the rebellion is over. The first book of Kings narrates David's last days and the reign of Solomon. So I'm going to leave this right here, and we're going to work together on the study guide to the questions that pertain to Samuel and to David, and then we're going to take a closer look at Solomon and his life and legacy tomorrow.